Hello everyone, welcome to Government 340. Today we will be discussing Central Asia in its historical context. And in order to do so, firstly we are going to be discussing how Central Asia has been studied across time. So there has been a lot of variation in the density of study of Central Asia. During some time periods, it was easier to study, such as when it was a single empire. It's much harder to study regions that are broken up into several different powers, and especially when those powers are in a great degree of fluctuation, when they speak different languages, when they didn't keep a lot of historical records. All of these things kind of culminate to make study particularly difficult. And when we look at like how Central Asia has been studied, we do see a lot of records on the Mongol Empire, for instance, but not a lot on the various Uzbek tribal khanates. Or we don't necessarily have a lot of information from these khanates themselves, but only from other imperial powers that were interacting with them. So we have records of like Muscovy, Muscovy's interactions with the Kazan Khanate, but we don't necessarily have records from the Kazan Khanate itself. So a lot of these historical records have to be taken with a grain of salt because a lot of the information is coming from outside actors who have their own views or their own political messages that they're trying to send with the way that they portray this region. It's also important to keep in mind that a lot of the early interactions between this region and the outside world were not ones that were particularly peaceful. So the legacy of both the Timurid Empire and the Mongol Empire, a lot of these various khanates, the Golden Horde, for instance, the Astrakhan khanates, the Crimean Khanate, a lot of Europe's and a lot of Europe and the what is now the Middle East and China saw the people from this region as conquerors or attempted conquerors. And this very much flavors how they interact and perceive Central Asia moving forward. The Mongol Empire in particular had a very big impact on how Muscovy and later the Russian Empire perceived Central Asia, and also flavored the treatment of the region when the tables were reversed and the Russian Empire invaded Central Asia. And as stated before, there are several difficulties in studying this region. So you have diverse languages. While a lot of languages spoken in the region are Turkic, there's may not be a lot of language understandability between those languages. So you have to learn a lot of languages in order to study the region. You have highly mobile populations that may not be keeping good records. In addition to the lack of records, we also see frequent fluctuations in power. So even if groups did keep good records, those records may have been destroyed. And in these cases, all of these combine together to make studying the region incredibly difficult, especially in time periods of intense change. In Central Asia, the Mongol Empire had a great impact on the groups that had the right to rule. Oftentimes, the only people who had the right to rule were those who could trace their lineage back to Genghis Khan. And if you could not do so, you did not have the right to rule. However, this did not mean that you could not conquer even if you were not related to Genghis Khan and the leadership of the Mongol Empire. And one such leader who did so was Timur, also known as Tamerlane, who lived between 1336 and 1405. And he started a dynasty that took over much of Central Asia, although he was much better at conquering than actually ruling the area. So he controlled largely only the sedentary portions of Central Asia, along with parts of Iran and Afghanistan. and did not exercise a lot of control over the more nomadic regions and the pastoral lands to the north of Central Asia. But still, he had great success in conquering the regions, even if he could not maintain them. And the empire controlled by his descendants was much smaller than the area that he did conquer. And later descendants actually moved south into India to found the Mughal Empire there, which was extremely successful, although it did not manage to keep its hold on Central Asia. And what is interesting about the Timurids, despite not being part of the descendants of the leaders of the Mongol Empire, they were the last major imperial power to emerge from Central Asia. So after the Timurids, what we see primarily are other powers moving into Central Asia, when prior to this point you saw a lot of Central Asian groups moving and forming empires out of Central Asia. So this region was for a very long time a military powerhouse, even if it did not maintain the empires that it formed in the long term. So this is really a turning point after the mid to late 1400s, where Central Asia stops being an imperial power. And this is largely due to the rise of various European powers and the rise of industrialization and the invention of guns and gunpowder. Once you see the decline in the power of the cavalry, you see a lot of the military might of Central Asia kind of collapse. And after that point, you see it becoming a subjugated region rather than one that is subjugating others. Still, there were various khanates that formed. One such was the Bukharan Khanate. This Khanate was the result of the last major migration from the steppe into Central Asia. So here in the photo, we can see the Eurasian steppe kind of outline. As I mentioned in my last lecture, the Eurasian steppe stretches all the way from eastern Mongolia into Europe and into Ukraine, and parts of it stretch even into Romania and Hungary. And this region is where you see a lot of nomadic groups. So it's a very good pastoral land. And it's also particularly flat. So it's very easy to move groups across the steppe. But this, at the start of the Bukharan Khanate, which moves into the land held by the Timurids, was a migration of about 200 to 400,000 Uzbeks out of the western steppe, and this is where you see a very large split between the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs, because the Kazakhs remain in the western steppe area. The Uzbeks move south and start the Bukharan Khanate. And these were a group of Uzbeks under the lead of Muhammad Shabani Khan. And as I stated, they unseated the Timurids, and the Kazakhs here split. So while these groups did live alongside one another, both as nomadic groups, you see a split occurring here where the Uzbeks became a much more sedentary group after this split occurred. And we can still see a lot of contestation to this day between ethnic Uzbeks and other ethnic groups in the south. In particular, Uzbeks and Kyrgyz and even Uzbek Tajik ethnic violence has been characteristic of the post-Soviet era. So this, despite happening several centuries ago, still has an impact in how these groups interact with one another in what is viewed as their historical homeland. After the Bukharan Khanate, what we instead see is the rise of outside encroachment onto this region. And so it's really facing two threats. Firstly, from the Russian Empire, which is now expanding from the north and west, and then from the Chinese Qing dynasty from the east. And these two groups had a large degree of success in conquering large portions of Central Asia. If we look at what the Chinese conquered during this time frame, a lot of the regions that they conquered are what UNESCO still considers to be parts of Central Asia. So this contains portions of Tibet, where the Jugar Buddhist groups lived, and also the majority of the present-day Chinese Uyghur population was conquered during this time period. The Russian encroachment was rather slow. They first moved into Kazakhstan and then very slowly pushed south. They did conquer more of the actual territory of what is present-day Central Asia than China did. But a lot of the various Khanate groups in Central Asia were dealing with this encroachment and trying to negotiate their own power vis-a-vis these major imperial ones. During this time period, we also see various Uzbek tribal dynasties coming to power. The first being the Kokand. This group was neighboring a group that the Ming Dynasty conquered, and when the Ming Dynasty did so, they were able to rise to prominence, and essentially they turned the Russian encroachment to their advantage, expanding their own trade options. And for a time period, this worked out in their favor, but Russia turned out to be a much more aggressive neighboring power than the Chinese were at this time, and very slowly encroached on their power. The Bukhara were likewise a major group during this time period, and the Kokand's greatest rival within the region. And during this time period, they were able to extend various trade and political networks into Siberia and to Russia. But the region became part of the Anglo-Russian colonial Cold War, and while this had little impact on the region directly at first, they were eventually reduced by the 1860s to little more than a Russian protectorate. And this was a common fate of a lot of groups within Central Asia. Khiva was the smallest of the three Uzbek tribal dynasties within the region. They were a sedentary zone. But they had relative ethnic uniformity in contrast to the other two. And this meant that they were able to organize a little bit more efficiently and were able to control the resources and their dispersion to the population to maintain power. However, all three of these dynasties were eventually brought under Russian control, which brings us to the Russian colonial period. So the Russian colonial period included the gradual conquest of the region between the 1830s through the 1900s. So this process lasted about 60 years. So it was a very long and slow process of the Russians pushing into the region. And once they had conquered Tashkent, they largely opened the rest of the region up to conquest, but they were still quite slow in moving their military in. And part of the reason for this is that the region is far away from the Russian capital, so they had relatively weak control for a long period of time. It was very difficult and time-consuming to move troops to Central Asia, and due to the slowness of communication, it was very difficult for them to respond to political changes occurring within the region. Because of this, the thing that caused one of the biggest impacts to the colonial rule of Central Asia was the invention of railroads. So the laying of a great deal of railroad tracks into Central Asia enabled the Russian Empire to much better control the region than they had before. Unfortunately, there was very little that they could do with the Russian Civil War. So when the Russian Civil War broke out, a lot of the regions of Russia's periphery broke away. And this included Central Asia. So for a short period of time, this region was able to exercise self-rule. And if we look at a timeline for these events, the Soviets were then left to reconquer Central Asia, along with regions in the Far East and in the West and in the North and South Caucasus. So in the 1917 revolution and then the Bolshevik Civil War, you see these regions largely being jettisoned from Russia proper, and exercising self-rule up until 1920, which was the end of the formal resistance against the Bolsheviks in Central Asia. In 1921, you see the establishment formally of the USSR. And in 1923, there was an approval of a policy of indigenization. So there was a practice of allowing some degree of self-rule of various Bolshevik leaders for a time period. And this was done because Soviet rule was relatively weak at this time period. And so, in order to maintain control, they allowed a degree of self rule. In 1924, you see the Kievan Khanate being brought into the Uzbek SSR. But in 1927, you see this policy of indigenization starting to be reversed. And part of this was the start of the repression of Islam within Central Asia. So you'll really only see this start occurring when the Soviet government felt comfortable that they could maintain control. In 1929, you see the start of agricultural collectivization. And while this did benefit some people, it definitely improved the living situation of some in some of the republics. It definitely did not do so in Kazakhstan and also in Ukraine, where you saw massive famines. And much like the start of repression, this allowed the Soviet government to exert greater control over the population. And in an accompaniment of this, you start to see the Soviets rewriting the territorial boundaries of the various Central Asian republics. So in 1929, you also see the creation of the Tajik SSR. Once collectivization had been in process for a length of time, you see in 1936 the Kazakh and Kyrgyz SSRs being established. And this is also the start of Stalin's Great Purges. And during this time, Stalin did target a lot of the major leaders who had been active in the Bolshevik Party in the 1920s. Seeing them as threats to his continued power. And finally, in 1941, you see the start of World War II, and the threat of World War II led to the suspension of all indigenization policies, both in Central Asia and in other parts of the Soviet Union. So once again, you're seeing over time a policy of increased repression in Central Asia. Alongside this policy, you see the Soviet Union very invested in creating what they dubbed the Soviet citizen. And so part of this was restructuring identities and nationalities. So once again, undercutting how these people had traditionally been organized and the boundaries of their own communities, reshuffling these to undercut the national identities and placing new ones on top of that. So there is this guise of allowing people to politically represent themselves while undercutting others, and creating kind of this dual nationhood that allows the Soviet Union to ultimately control politics. You also saw the treatment of religion being highly variable over this time period. So originally, when the Soviets retook over large portions of Central Asia, they were very tolerant of Islam. But this is largely because their political power over the region was weak. And during the Stalin period, you see increasing levels of repression within the region of Islam. And after Stalin's death, you see the repression continue, but not to the same degree. Without Stalin, there was less of a risk of purges being ongoing within Central Asia. So this opened up a bit of space for various groups to start to organize. And one of the ways that we see groups start to organize is through the spiritual administration of the Muslims of Central Asia and Kazakhstan. So once again, keep in mind that Kazakhstan is not in Central Asia according to Soviet scholars. This organization was dubbed the Sadam, and it was essentially a way for the government to monitor the Islamic populations within Central Asia. But this also gave them a degree of political freedom where they could actually organize, unlike during the Stalin period. But the Stalin period still had an impact on Islam. So while you started to see like Saddam organize and have various educational institutions associated with it, and kind of the revival of the Islamic political elite, you had very few people actually observing Islam. So while you started to have this organization, you had very few people who were actively and openly practicing Islam. And this is what you see change in the post Soviet era. So you see a massive resurgence in the practicing and in the observance of Islam in the post Soviet era. So you see a high degree of practice of Islam in the pre Soviet era, but you see observances of Islam drop off during the Soviet era and then a resurgence once the Soviet Union collapsed. And even now, the way Islam is practiced in the region has a great degree of cultural aspects kept over from the Soviet period. So a lot of Islamic practices were de-religified for the Soviet period, and that has kept going even in the post-Soviet era. Another thing that we see the Soviets very much caring about is the education of the Central Asian population. The Russian perspective of Central Asia is that it was a backwards region that they had the responsibility to bring into the modern era. And in doing so, they created a variety of education programs. And part of this is that propaganda really only works if you have a literate population. So they had a lot of literacy programs in place. They also consistently changed what alphabet the population was writing with. So they forced a switch from Arabic to the Latin alphabet, linking the Latin alphabet with modernization and the Arabic alphabet with cultural and economic backwardness. But as the Soviets solidified their power, they switched from the Latin alphabet to the Cyrillic one, which a lot of Central Asian states still use to this day, although there are debates about whether or not they should switch back to the Latin alphabet or even the Arabic alphabet now. But these programs were largely put in place for the purposes of controlling the population and teaching them about the Soviet ideology and about socialism. So to really create better Soviet citizens through the creation of education. And part of the reason that they needed these education programs was the fact that they were attempting to collectivize